Charlotte Juergens, thank you very much for taking the time out to speak with us about your remarkable documentary, Sunken Roads, which follows you on your journey with a group of World War II veterans to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the D-Day landings. And I think it's an extraordinary film, very, very well made. So congratulations on that. I'd like to begin, though, just by setting the table, telling us just a little bit about yourself, about how old you are, when you were born, and just give us a nutshell biography of yourself.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. This is great to speak with you today. So a little bit about me. I'm a filmmaker from Brooklyn, New York. I am currently 27 years old, but I was 20 years old when I shot Sunken Roads. I was born in 1994 and grew up lucky to be the daughter of two filmmakers. So I think it was kind of, I didn't think I was going to be a filmmaker when I was growing up, but now it feels very much like home to be in this industry. And so I made this film when I shot the film when I was a sophomore in undergrad, so my second year. And
where was that?
I was at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut.
Yep.
And I had become increasingly interested in World War II history at college, and I also was fascinated with the story of my great-grandfather who fought on D-Day. And as those two interests kind of collided, the film was born.
Okay, just to unpack that for a moment, I'm very interested to know what ignited your interest in World War II military history.
Well, I would say I'd been actually interested in military history, I want to say since fifth grade. I was interested in the history of the American Civil War and particularly the memory of the American Civil War. And that was just a childhood interest that became more serious as I got older. And then I would say as a teenager, I became really interested in the First World War and oral histories of the war and actually a lot of really amazing Australian writing about the war. So then when I was in college, I took a class that kind of changed my life with Professor Jay Winter about the two world wars, one and two, and really focusing on the human experience, on diaries, letters, novels, first person accounts. And so it was in that context that my interest in World War II history kind of emerged.
Yes, but what was it that made you interested? I mean, you could have taken up skateboarding. You could have developed an interesting architecture or something else. What was the spark? What was the ignition point for your interest in military history? Why?
I would say that it was much less to do with the military than with certain very kind of emotionally gripping first person stories that I encountered. First through, I think through film, not through documentaries, but through other films. And then I got really, really interested. I've always loved history. Ever since I was a little kid, I've been passionate about history. Why I've been so into that forever, it's hard to say. But I grew up in my mother's house is a really, really old house, and I just grew up always just imagining the lives of the people who would have lived in the house and just thinking about what my neighborhood might have been like 100 years ago, further ago. I just have always loved that.
Okay.
And so I got really into reading diaries and letters and compilations of diaries and letters. And so my interest in military history, I kind of stumbled into that, but first and foremost, my interest in history is always grounded in a sense of individual stories and what I guess when it comes to military history, I've been more interested in the memory of the war, the cost of war, what that actually does to communities and families, rather than, being interested in kind of military strategy or technology or things like that.
Yeah, well, it certainly is reflected in the film in that it's a very humanist film.
Mm.
You go to some effort to recreate a rather vivid picture of the landings, and it's really not preoccupied with what the bigger picture was about, liberating France and going through. It's a real on the ground verite documentary, is the way I would describe it. And
Thank
just
you.
yeah, and just to get into it, can you just tell me a bit about your approach to documentary making? Because it is pretty raw and it's rough around the edges, but that's deliberate on your part. You left
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of stuff, camera flubs, mistakes and so on, that you could very easily, Charlotte
Mm-hmm.
Juergens, have cut around. And you
Mm-hmm.
could have made a much more polished film if you wanted to. But you chose not to do that. Why?
So it's interesting that you mentioned cinema verite, because I would say the cinema verite films of the French New Wave and also verite films from the 80s in the US, like Sherman's March, were really inspirational to me going in. I would say the two films that inspired me the most were Sherman's March by Ross McElwee and Faces Places by Agnes Varda. Um, and Agnes Varda's films in general were hugely influential for me, both in the shooting process and throughout post production. Um, One thing I love about films by those filmmakers and others kind of in that cinema verite school, is that you always have a sense that this is not a kind of voice of God documentary telling you the official history of XYZ. It's a very subjective, personal piece of art where you're always aware as a viewer that there's a person behind the camera and that anything that you're seeing is a result of kind of a mediated interaction. Like there's the camera, there's someone behind the camera, and then there's the subject, and it's not a objective view of anything. And I always appreciated that sense of transparency. And so in the edit, we really tried to kind of capture that by kind of repeatedly breaking the illusion that the audience is viewing anything objective. And I appreciate you kind of bringing that up because that was something that was really important to me.
Well, it gives the film a very strong organic feel, actually incorporating the research process, your journey of discovery, actually including that in the film, adds, I think, a richness to it, as well as a dirt under the fingernails degree of honesty. For instance, when you mention ceremony fatigue,
Mm-hmm.
I laughed in appreciation at that because I thought a formal documentary maker or a formal documentary, a more formalized documentary, would probably not mention the fact that there are so many ceremonies. It all becomes a bit of a blur.
Yes. Yes. And, particularly when you're traveling with a group of folks in their 90s, however exhausted I was, they were much more exhausted. And that's not to say that they weren't incredibly emotionally engaged and appreciative as well. They were, but it doesn't change the fact that you have a very packed schedule full of events that have a kind of the same rhythm again and again. So, yeah.
Yeah. Now, Charlotte, can you just put us in the proper generational frame? What
Sure.
generation letter are you part of? Are you Gen Z?
I'm right on the edge between millennial and Gen Z.
All right.
I am definitely at the tail end of millennial. And I think that a big part of that is like, I remember not having the internet, I like very clearly. There are a lot of kind of like, I think pivotal, um, like historical moments such as September 11th that I remember very vividly that I think puts me more in the millennial age group, but definitely on the very edge,
Right.
almost Gen Z.
Okay.
Yeah.
The reason why I mention that is because I want you to confront this the stereotype
Mm,
of young people today, like yourself, that are held by people of my generation, which is the boomer generation.
mm,
I guess the cliched response to your film is, oh, how wonderful that a young person, especially a young American person, actually has an interest in their nation's history. The presumption being that they're all too preoccupied with their digital devices and with dating and with spending time online and mucking around, and that they're sort of losing connection with their own history.
mm.
Now, Charlotte, to what degree do you believe that that's accurate, and to what extent is the film intended as a reminder to your generation about American history?
I really appreciate that question. You know, I don't feel like I'm in a position to like make a sweeping statement about my generation, but I will say that there's so many people I know in my generation with a real passionate, lifelong interest in history. Um, I can't say whether on average that's less than in previous generations, but what I will say is that I think that people engage with history a little differently in my generation. And I think that sometimes there can be frustration on the part of older generations that people in younger generations aren't picking up on the same types of historical narratives that worked for them. So, for instance, I think a lot of people in my generation, rhetoric like uh, rhetoric like the Greatest Generation, referring to
Yes.
World War II, can be kind of alienating. It can be a little bit like, well, especially if you never knew them, like, well, then, I mean, they're the best. They're up on this pedestal. They're almost these kind of monumental figures that you can barely emotionally relate to. They seem so stoic and so perfect and so like uber masculine in a way that it's very hard to engage with. Um, but I think that for this film, what I was hoping to do was to show that generation, that older generation of folks in their 90s, as real human beings, as like vulnerable, funny, um, emotional, alive, tangible people, um, who you can, who are interested in sharing things with you and meeting halfway to do so. Because I think one of the things about the veterans in this film is that it wasn't just me being interested in reaching to try to understand their generation. They were very much willing to kind of have these conversations with me and very interested in engaging me as well. So it's very much a two-way street, I think. And I do hope that the film will serve as kind of a reminder to my generation that like just because something seemed dry when you learned it in history class doesn't mean that it is inherently dry. If you take the initiative to try to figure it out for yourself, there's a lot to be found. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yes, I do. And I just wanted to commend you for raising the issue of the greatest generation tag. Your film is very much almost an antidote to the idea of the glorification of war.
Mm-hmm.
And you get that from the emotional reactions from the veterans, that they react to the loss of a buddy as if it happened that day. And I think
Yes.
you certainly capture that. Also, I know that the tag, the greatest generation, was is intended to laud and to commemorate and to recognize all those people who fought in the Second World War. Unfortunately, I think you've actually picked up a very important point, that it does tend to glorify that generation. And so when you talk about the alienation that can result in young people, it's understandable. So I think maybe that tag might be a mistake.
Well, I think it also just played differently at the time when people started saying the greatest generation, because if you hear the term greatest generation but you also associate that generation with your own dad, who you have very personal memories of, it's like it's part of the way you understand World War II, and maybe it contributes to a sense of appreciation for sacrifice, but it's not your complete picture of it. Whereas I think for people who will never have a chance to meet these people in person, when all you're left with is that greatest generation language, it doesn't give you much room to emotionally
Yeah.
engage.
What impact do you think Saving Private Ryan had on the understanding and the appreciation of World War II with kids of your generation?
I think that for people who have seen it, it probably had a pretty big impact. I think that, when I think about Saving Private Ryan, I always find it helpful to think about it kind of in two parts. There's the beginning, with that very visceral landing scene, and then there's the rest of the movie. And for me, I think that that beginning does a really wonderful job of conveying the horrors of war and de-romanticizing it. Um, I feel less that way about the rest of the film, even though I do enjoy watching that film. I think that, what it kind of promises to convey at the beginning, it shifts a little bit later. Um, I, I think that a fair amount of people in my generation have probably seen that film, and if so, that has a big impact on their understanding of D-Day. But I also know a lot of people in my generation who have kind of a vague sense of what D-Day was, but it flows into other World War II events, or like they know that it was an important turning point in the war. So I think that for people in my generation, if they have seen Saving Private Ryan, that beginning part, that landing scene, might be the salient image in terms of what that war was like on an emotional level. But I can't really speak to exactly how many people have
Sure.
seen it in my generation. I feel like it's more ubiquitous in earlier generations.
Now, in the
Yeah.
film, you make the very salient point about, as you're traveling through France, how well educated French children are about the Second World War in contrast to American kids. Can you just speak to that just for a moment? That is the education system, do you feel, failing
Yeah.
American history with young kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the issues in the US in terms of teaching to standardized tests is that a lot of the time, standardized tests, the things that come later in the school year, are less important on the test, because they're not sure that everyone will get to it. So the things that come earlier in the school year are tested more, they matter more, you spend more time on them. Um, Things might have changed since I was in high school, obviously. But I remember spending maybe 2 days on World War II.
Oh,
Yeah. And that, I mean, in the context, I remember taking like world history and US history, and I think that you touch on it in both, but it's very brief. And understandably, there's a lot of, and I don't mean to say this in a negative way at all, there's a lot of focus on the Holocaust, which I think matters a massive amount. But when you only have a couple of days to spend on it and you want to convey the horrors of the Holocaust, that leaves incredibly little room for anything else at all. And my memories of studying World War II in high school for school, as opposed to like reading things on my own, was just kind of a desperate attempt to memorize names, dates, battles, facts, generals, stuff like that. And that is not any doing that, in my experience at least, was never going to be an engaging process. It's like you're cramming for a test and you're desperate to get that information in. And I think that compared to children in Normandy who, the war was on their land. This is the story of their hometowns. It feels incredibly immediate, and they've been learning about it in a very emotionally engaged way since early childhood. It's just there's no comparison really.
Yeah.
I just think that like the more that kind of high school and younger history education can be grounded um, in stories that people will actually find interesting and be able to relate to their own lives, but the more that people will actually develop a long-lasting interest in these subjects. And I mean, on a related note, one of the things I'm most excited about with Sunken Roads is getting it into schools and having it be a film that would supplement that kind of, more fact-based history education. Because I think that Sunken Roads is the kind of thing where I'm hoping that it will allow people who are even younger than me to feel like they get to know these guys as if they knew them in their personal life. And I know that for me, because I never knew my great grandfather who inspired the film, becoming close friends with the veterans who are the characters of Sunken Roads allowed me to feel as if I had known my great grandfather, and that's what I want for children who'd be encountering Sunken Roads in an educational context.
Okay. Can you just tell me just quickly about that? Just how the film is traveling and your interest in getting it into the curriculum at schools?
Yes. So right now we just had our theatrical run in New York and Los Angeles, which was great. And our distributor, First Run Features, is working with several other theaters to have it available through virtual cinema, where basically you can rent it to stream through a local theater for a given number of days. Like I think you rent it and then you have access to it for 3 days. And I'm really excited about that option during COVID because a lot of people aren't going to theaters then. And because those virtual cinema links are accessible worldwide. So there's just the chance for international audiences to see the film right now, which is great. So that goes through December 9th. And people can watch the film that way. Just go to sunkenroads.com and then to the event page and you can see those. So that's what we're focusing on at the present moment. Then it moves on to the hunt for streaming, possibly broadcast, and as we were discussing, educational distribution. So the film is currently available on Canopy, which is an educational streaming platform. And so right now I'm a PhD student and I'm excited to work with my university and other universities to kind of integrate it into curriculums at the university level. So that's something that I'm focusing on right away. I'm also going to be preparing a curriculum, like what's it called? I'm blanking on the word. Like a document.
That's okay.
Yeah, I'm preparing a document that can be a teaching aid for teachers of high school and younger, to kind of pull out key archival documents from the film for students to analyze, or a key moment in the film with like questions and things like that to make it easier. But one thing I'm really glad about with working with our distributor, First Run, is that they have a really strong track record with educational distribution. And that was one of the main things that made me excited about working with them.
Okay. You are of the generation where everything is filmed. You've got cameras everywhere.
Yeah.
What's the saying that if it's not filmed, it hasn't happened, or if you haven't photographed it, it hasn't happened. The average birthday party has got more coverage than most major events in history. It's remarkable. Charlotte, how did you react to the fact that these huge historical events had relatively scant visual records?
Yeah, well, so that was kind of a wonderful challenge. You know, aside from being a director, I'm also an archival producer. So I work on other people's films, searching for archival documentation, whether that's photos or documents or film footage. So I knew that the Robert Capa images of D-Day were pretty much the strongest, you know, direct visual representations of the immediate landings. And I felt that I didn't want to rely on those too much, because those images have been used so often that I worry that people are a little desensitized to them. So it felt like a really great challenge to try to figure out what to use instead. So I was at the National Archives doing a lot of digging, and I found this collection of art done by Coast Guard service members who had landed on D-Day as part of a PTSD art therapy course after the war. And some of these drawings that they did of their experiences were so vivid. And so those appear a lot during the film as kind of, I guess, alternatives to the Capa photographs. And even if they weren't, you know, images captured while these people were on the ground, they really seemed to capture the emotional nature of their experiences. So I was excited to use that. And I mean, the fact that things weren't documented that precisely, I guess, it didn't, just hearing the veterans talk about their experiences. I know Don brought a camera with him. He had planned to take pictures, but his camera went into the sea the second that their landing craft was fired on. I mean, so hearing stories like that, it kind of amazed me that there were any images at all of such a kind of insane and hellish event. So, yeah.
It is interesting, again, just in contrast, that conflicts today, the war in Afghanistan and Iraq Desert Storm and all the rest of it, there are hours and hours and hours of footage on YouTube. Sometimes just chronicling, you know, just what an average day is like for a soldier. Right. And you just contrast that to, you know, the few scant minutes. You mentioned the Robert Capa images, of which apparently there are 9. He took a lot more, but the printer screwed it up, and what a tragedy that is. But it's you. Just with the images that you do use, I commend you for kind of veering away from the very famous images we have of D-Day. We do get glimpses of them, but you have opted to create very vivid word pictures through descriptions, which you supplement with very judicious use of footage, of images, and of those illustrations. So well done.
Thank you.
Okay. Now, at one point in the making of the film, you had to make a very hard decision about which narrative line to follow, to either continue with the veterans or to continue exploring the story of, was it your great-grandfather?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. To continue following the story of your great-grandfather, which you are in the process of discovering, is becoming increasingly blurred the closer you look at it. Now, firstly, tell me how hard a decision that must have been for you. And secondly, have you done any follow-up about what the real story of your great-grandfather actually is?
So it was an incredibly difficult decision. It was, it felt kind of nightmarish when I first learned that my great-grandfather's D-Day story did not align as closely as I thought with the veterans whom I was traveling with. I had previously been under the impression that his route was pretty much the same as their route. And as I worked with Joe Balkowski, the division historian of the 29th Infantry Division, just going through my great-grandfather's papers, and then finally listening to this amazing audio recording of his voice that my mother did in the 90s, where he describes the terrain where he landed on D-Day and things like that. We realized that I would have to leave if I wanted to follow his story. You know, that realization came at a very emotional moment for me. I'd become really close with the veterans. One of the veterans, the cousin of the main character, so this would be Bill, was really having pretty severe health issues with his Parkinson's disease. And I was really concerned about him even making it through the trip. And that was one of the real deciding factors for me, because I really knew that if I left to follow my grandfather's story with certain of these very new but very dear friends of mine, I might never see them again at all. And I almost certainly would never see them all together again. And when I actually was able to kind of clarify it for myself and put it in those terms, it was really clear to me what I had to do and that I should stay with them. But it was a really hard decision in the moment. And then this question of following up on my grandfather's papers. Yes, I spent a lot of time kind of fruitlessly trying to get more documents from the National Archives. There was a big fire there a while ago, and it seems like there are no more documents for me to get, whether that means that they were actually lost in a fire, or they're lost, or they are not going to be given to the public. I can't really say for sure, but you know, the archival trail completely ran cold, and that was hard to make peace with. But I also feel very lucky that I feel like on an emotional level, I've gotten to understand his world far more than I ever could have through those missing documents. So, yeah.
I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't throw some criticisms at you. And I'll give 3 main ones, and I'll just give them to you now, and you can respond in the way you like. The relationship you have with Arden, who starts calling you his granddaughter, I thought was kind of interesting and a little bit creepy, I guess. And that was something that I guess you could have explored a bit more. Also, when you're on that gun emplacement and you make the point through narration about how much these young American kids know about their history, there was an opportunity surely there to actually talk to them and see what their situation was. Also, you mentioned your differing reactions to hearing the last post, taps. I would love to have heard your explanation as to what those differing reactions were and why you thought you had them. Now, Charlotte, I understand that you can't get everything into a film, and I'm allowing for the fact that you may actually have covered that material but edited it out. But what's your response to those observations?
Sure. So when it comes to Arden, I understand that you felt that way. For me, it never felt creepy. I'll just say that at all. He's, if you had ever met him in person, you'd realize that he's the last person in the world to be creepy. But that's not necessarily something that is obvious as a viewer. So I completely understand that you had that reaction, but I'll just confirm that as a young woman in that position, I never even once had the slightest tinge of any creepy vibes ever. The thing that I was worried about with Arden was that Arden actually has a granddaughter, who is wonderful. And I was worried about her reaction and how she would feel about all of this. And I had the chance to show the film to her and her father at our screening at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans in 2019. And I had a great conversation with her afterwards, because she kind of admitted that she was really hesitant about the film at first and about me, and was kind of like, well, who is this random person who my grandfather is suddenly calling his granddaughter? But then through watching the film, she had a change of heart, I guess. And it meant a lot to me to have her, say welcome to the family, which was a huge deal to me. And I think that the honest truth is that for all of these veterans, it was a massive honor for them to trust me with their stories. And it's a lot of trust, especially with such traumatic stories. So that, to me, it really felt like a lifelong commitment making this film. It's not just about churning out a film in a few years. It's about going to every funeral and being there in whatever way is helpful, and doing whatever I can to actually continue to be helpful and have a positive relationship with families. And it's been kind of wonderful and humbling, the degree to which, like, not only Arden's family but Don's family as well have really kind of welcomed me in. And yeah, I mean, I am sorry that you had that reaction, but it felt very genuine to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me in the if I'm being honest with you and I'm being open and being critical, having heard that, you know what? I think maybe the word creepy is too approximate. I think a better word that I should have used was just unsettling to see that. So let me just acknowledge for the record that unsettling would have been a more accurate way to describe the reaction to seeing that. So I just want to make that clear. I hope that's okay.
That. Yeah, and I think that there are a lot of things that happen when you're in a kind of like an emotionally charged, super kind of stressful and emotional period of time, and you become really close with people really fast, so fast that in normal life you'd be like, how could you possibly feel that way about somebody? But that is kind of how it happened, I guess. And then the second question was about about the American children. Yeah, I could have talked to them. I, at that moment, was feeling pretty emotional myself and didn't want to, ruin their day or I didn't really feel like I could be coming from a place of kind of like cheery neutrality to like strike up a conversation. And, that was something that I did not, shoot interviews with those children, but I agree that it could have been a very fruitful conversation. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's a very valid point you're making there, that, it's very easy to think that because you have a camera and you're making a documentary that you can just step into anybody's day and suddenly potentially change it, possibly for the worse. So again, just acknowledging, I think, the validity of that response. It's a very intelligent response. to a very typically ham-fisted question from an old journalist. So there you go.
No, it's a good question, and I think that I really do agree that that could have been a really interesting conversation. Absolutely, yeah.
And what about taps?
With taps, I would say so. The one
Did you just get tired of hearing it? I mean, that's an honest thing. It's a beautiful, piece of music. But if you hear it 50,000 times, it can start wearing on your nerves.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say so. The one that I play that we edited in at the very end, when I say some of them catch me off guard, that is my favorite version of taps that we played. And I think watching through that scene again recently, the earlier versions, you can kind of hear the rustling of the people around who are tired and they've been through 5 ceremonies today, and somebody drops a bag and something's like, you're not really engaged, right? But that one just felt like a very well, first of all, whoever was playing it was a wonderful musician and played it with such clarity and precision, and everyone was quiet and everyone just felt very connected to it. So that might not come across as clearly to a viewer as it does to me when I'm watching it, and I understand that. But that was the difference to me. Yeah, I think that one also happened earlier in the day when we were all a little bit more fresh. But yes, I mean, it wasn't just taps; it was that other song, "Roll Out the Barrels," which I think I had that kind of stuck in my head for like 2 years after filming it. It's just like da 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 da. And it's just like after a while you're like again. Oh my god. But yeah. The same thing with the Marseillaise, the French national anthem. All those songs that happen in the ceremonies. It's just like a little bit. Like you said, when you hear it too many times, it does your head in.
What did you shoot this on?
It was a Sony A7R2. When we were figuring out which camera to use, I had certain priorities. I really wanted something that was not physically large because I didn't want it to be intimidating or to get in the way between me and the conversation. And I wanted something that was really good at shooting in low light because there were a lot of situations that were not lit in a ideal way for a camera, and I needed a camera that could just kind of cope with that, and I wanted something that I felt enough like muscle memory to not have to be looking at it all the time, and that was my mother's camera. My mother's an amazing camera woman in addition to being an editor, and it was the camera that I learned to shoot on, and I felt comfortable with it. So that's what we used. Yeah.
Can I also just quickly add, just in terms of the Verite style of the film, sometimes your framing is a bit imperfect, and sometimes I think the autofocus is going backwards and forwards. I say that in praise of the film, because what we have now, because of digital technology, I think, is a move away from the formalism of documentary filmmaking, where portable cameras and the benefits of portable cameras, as you've just outlined, does also lend itself to camera work that doesn't have a tripod or that's done in a very cramped space. So again, I just wanted to say that from a stylistic point of view, that the roughness of it enriches the veracity of the film. Now, favorite question, whenever I speak to independent American filmmakers, how much money from the government did you get to make this movie?
Oh, zero.
Tell me about the financing of this
production budget for this was under $50,000. Or not production, the entire budget for the whole thing was under $50,000.
Oh my God. How long did it take you to make this thing?
8 years.
You made this film for 50 grand.
Mm-hmm.
And how did you raise that puny amount of money?
Yeah. Well, so I was a college student at the time, and I did a Kickstarter campaign that raised $35,000. And that was really stressful, but I'm so glad that we did it because those 200 and something Kickstarter supporters were the people who made it possible to make this film. I also got a couple of grants through my university, which were for summer travel. So the entire production budget was $3,000 to shoot the film, which came from the summer travel stipend from my university. It would have been the same no matter what I was doing. And yeah, I mean, that's what I had, but I also had the amazing resource of the parents who I grew up with, and being able to not have to buy new camera gear and use my mother's gear was massive. And then when it comes to making the film, I am very grateful to many people who worked on this project for far less than they should have normally been paid, or in some cases for free. And it, that generosity is what made it possible. So, yeah. The
You
funding was
survived.
so difficult, and it created a lot of anxiety too. I mean, I remember in 2018, we still didn't have the money for the sound mix and sound edit. And, I was sitting there after 4 years having worked on this film, and it felt like a very real possibility that no one would ever see it and that it would never get finished. And it was, that is a terrible thing to think about when you're that far into a project. But again, through some incredibly generous donations of time by really talented people who were like, I hope if I have the chance to work with them again, I'll be able to pay them properly. But that's how it happened. I'm really lucky in that way.
What are you studying at Yale?
So I was at Yale for undergrad, and I studied history. Then I got my master's degree at the University of Chicago, where I also studied history. I was in an interdisciplinary program, but my focus was history. And now I'm getting my PhD at the University of Michigan, and I'm doing American studies. So the program is in American culture, but my focus is again in history. But I'm really excited to be in this interdisciplinary American culture program because they're much more supportive of my work as a filmmaker than most traditional history departments would be. So.
And is that what you want to do? You want to do filmmaking? You want to be a full-time filmmaker?
Yes. I mean, I do also want to pursue my interest in history from an academic standpoint. I also love academic writing, and to me, not every project wants to be a film. Some projects that I'm really interested in aren't that visual, and I hope that I can continue to pursue those projects as well. So in my ideal world, I would be able to continue in history academia and teaching history, but present part of my work in film form and part of my work in written form.
Do you have another project in the pipeline?
I do. Thank you. Yeah. My next project is a feature-length documentary about people who are working on COVID memorials with the pandemic still ongoing. So it kind of combines one story that's very personal about an artist who's making a memorial gallery space to her best friend who just died of COVID. And the other one is a much more collective story. It's about a citywide memorial that's being co-created in Detroit by thousands of families across the city. So this film is going to be kind of an exploration of grief after mass trauma, both private grief and public grief, and what it means to be mourning alone versus mourning as a community. So that's the new project.
There is a brief film clip of you on YouTube where you are addressing the United Nations International Peace Day.
Oh, yes. That was, early in college. Wow. Yeah.
And in that you talk about, the nuclear arms race and the need to get rid of nuclear weapons and the insanity of the mutually assured destruction policy, very appropriately abbreviated to MAD, MAD. Charlotte, has your worldview changed since that address?
Oh, no, of course. I still think that, nuclear disarmament and nonproliferation are extraordinarily important priorities. I had that opportunity because I worked briefly in New Zealand for a summer for an organization called Parliamentarians for Nuclear Disarmament. PNND is the abbreviation of the organization. It was in high school, so it was a long time ago. But it was a wonderful experience. And, when I was in college, before I made this film, I thought that maybe I would want my career to be in political advocacy. But I had my life changed by making Sunken Roads, and I now want to be working as a storyteller and historian, but those other priorities are still really important to me.